In 1956, Paramount Pictures released an adaptation of the extremely acclaimed Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy's extremely acclaimed Russian novel, War and Peace. The film, starring Henry Fonda and Audrey Hepburn, opened to critical and commercial success and went on to receive nominations from both the Academy Awards and the Golden Globes. It even managed to get a welcome embrace from the Soviet Union once it crossed over in 1959. Famously, King Vidor's Hollywood product attracted over 30 million theatergoers in the then Soviet Union, and this attention to an American reproduction of a fundamental Russian tale was not something the powers behind the USSR were very happy to see happen. This led to the production of a Soviet adaptation of War and Peace, planned to be a gigantic epic that did justice to the source material in ways Vidor's version could only dream of, and doubly serve as a defiant rebuttal to the Americans for even attempting to make their version in the first place. Ultimately, the end results, created by second-time director Sergei Bondarchuk, became one of the most singularly monumental and likely unrepeatable series of films to have ever existed in the history of the medium. To this day, they, and his subsequent film Waterloo, are held in high regard for the gigantic scope each of them are able to elicit on screen. The number of extras used for Bondarchuk's War and Peace mounts into the thousands. So for this reason, and many others, it's no surprise that things behind the scenes were so tumultuous for Bondarchuk. The production was a classic Soviet affair. That is to say, it was long, arduous, heavily influenced by the state, and caused undue suffering for all of those who participated in it. Sergei Bondarchuk himself was even legally declared dead during the 5 years of principal photography. Twice. It happened 2 different times. There were just so many chances for this grand epic to all fall apart while it was being made, and that's putting aside the possibility that the vision doesn't come together and the movie just turns out shit in the end. Undue stress doesn't always equal amazing results. And I'm sure King Vidor had his own problems with producer Dino De Laurentiis, but I can't imagine that Sergei Bondarchuk had a better time making a movie that had to get the all clear from the top brass of the Soviet fucking Union. It should be noted that Sergei didn't even just make one movie. He made 4, each serving as a different section of the novel so as to provide a more full and accurate adaptation. And this commitment, though admirable, does border on the insane and reckless when you think about the actual consequences that came from this commitment. Still, looking back half a century later, it is impossible to not appreciate the sheer undertaking that was Sergei's adaptation of War and Peace. The things that are done in that movie are essentially impossible to do now, unless someone ever gets the all clear again to use a large section of a global superpower's military to make a battle scene look cooler. And even then, the further we get away from those 4 films, the less it feels like we're watching something that was created on the same planet we're currently living on. As is often bemoaned, we don't really make movies the way we used to, and that can be both a good and a bad thing. Nobody has ever really been able to make something like War and Peace again, and they probably never will. As the principles of filmmaking become more and more truncated with every passing day, it can make Sergei Bandicoot's War and Peace feel like an alien movie that exists completely removed from the rules of the rest of the filmmaking world. You can go ahead and watch it yourself and get an unforgettable experience, but it still will be an experience foreign to just about all modern languages of film. The one thing that the universally acclaimed masterpiece does have in common with contemporary cinema is one I'm sure you could have guessed from the title of the video. Though few have managed to carry on Sergei's legacy for a certain brand of cinematography and scale, the practice of splitting up and separating films in a series has become just a little bit too commonplace for me as of late. In the past few years, we have seen film series after film series abruptly halted in their tracks so one movie can effectively become 2. And I'm ashamed to say that none of these bisected films, at least as of right now, has managed to live up to the high bar set by this 7-hour Soviet war epic from the 1960s. Said Soviet war epic had the excuse that they were adapting a 1,200-page classic novel, but few of these modern filmmakers really have access to that same justification. Denis Villeneuve is probably the closest, as he's been trying to adapt the unadaptable in his Dune movies. But when it comes to the animated Spider-Man and the Fantastic Furious, they really have no excuse. And these 3 are hardly the only examples, they're just some of the most recent ones that have come out. Going back over the different eras of cinema history, you can see this practice of cutting a film in two pieces cropping up again and again as a solution that Hollywood has used whenever they, in their infinite wisdom, deem it necessary. You can even argue that the new Hollywood urge to endlessly sequelize blockbuster movies like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg pioneered might have been an early progenitor of this practice. But I want to make a distinction early on here in regards to what I'm talking about. Because I am not talking about making a movie with a definitive ending and then pointlessly elongating it with a sequel. I am not talking about making a movie and leaving things on a cliffhanger so you can build up hype for a potential sequel. And I'm not even talking about that thing where a sequel does come out years later and it's just given the same title as the first movie but with a big old part 2 at the end of it, so now everyone has to act like the first movie was part 1 and that this whole thing was planned from the start, even though everyone knows that obviously wasn't. All of those practices are annoying in their own way, but it's not what we're talking about here. In fact, I'd argue it's perfectly fine to purposefully leave things out of a film or only hint at certain aspects of a plot if it is going to be followed up in a hypothetical sequel later. That is basically exactly how George Lucas made the original Star Wars trilogy. But again, that's not what I'm talking about, because even though creating a film series like that does imply some desire to overextend and usually franchise out, it still is comprised of films being created like a normal film in a normal production cycle. Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and The Return of the Jedi were all made independently from each other. All it takes is one incestuous kiss to reveal that. And risks like that are what's undertaken when you let your hand off the wheel a bit and don't try to micromanage a complete story into several different films released years apart. The story of Luke Skywalker starts with A New Hope and ends with Return of the Jedi, yes, but every movie has its own individual conflicts for him and his allies to face and overcome. Each movie still has a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end. So to be clear, what I am talking about is this curious tendency as of late to just openly and deliberately not do this. To not let movies have acts, to not let movies have pacing, to not let movies even have finales, to just instead let them end whenever. And it really makes me wonder what, if any, benefits are being given to the films that are split up in this way. As I point out in another video, the practice of splitting movies is not something as cut and dry as the splitting of television seasons that companies like Netflix do. Seasons are split more often than not to take advantage of benefits that are unique to owning a streaming service. And that can work out well for you if you own your own streaming service and the service is actually profitable, but for everyone else, their audiences by and large watch movies whenever and wherever it's convenient for them. The main drive for filmmakers isn't to keep people coming back to your platform. The main drive is to make sure they're hooked enough to your stories, your character, your world, whatever, enough so that they pay money for the sequel. And the sequel after that, and the sequel after that, and the sequel after that. But having said that, I don't want to act like this is a one-sided issue. Because I think the practice of splitting up films can work, or even be completely justified if it's for the sake of the story. War and Peace is technically 4 separate novels, so the justification made by Sergei's films to be split into 4 separate pieces isn't completely unfounded. I feel it's a pretty solid reason to split up a film because it serves the story that Sergei was trying to tell. And it's a reason that would be used effectively again decades later by a director named Peter Jackson. You might know that in the early 2000s, he made a back-to-back-to-back 3-film adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings novels, which, along with War and Peace, turned out to be one of the greatest examples of how separating a film's story into segmented pieces could yield great results. However, just as that was happening, 2 lovely ladies were busy making their own famous film trilogy, and like Jackson, they decided to opt in to a back-to-back production schedule for the final 2 films in their series. The sequels to The Matrix, created by the Wachowski sisters, serve as an odd counterpoint to the live-action Lord of the Rings trilogy. As for every benefit that Peter Jackson managed to get out of splitting his 3 movies into one long production, Lana and Lilly just got more problems for doing the exact same thing. Jackson made The Return of the King and got an Oscar for Best Picture, while the Wachowskis made Matrix Revolutions and basically torpedoed their whole career.
I create life! And I destroy it.
Now, neither of these films really have all that much in common with each other, other than being released at around the same time. Still, I think it is interesting to examine them close together, seeing as how one of them succeeded so absolutely, and the other just completely sank. You can't even act like it's an unfair comparison, as both of these franchises were, at the time, on pretty equal levels of cultural impact. Peter Jackson arguably had a much harder time since The Lord of the Rings was already deemed unfilmable before he went ahead and filmed it. And sure, you could say that having arguably the most seminal fantasy novel ever created serving as your foundation to be a huge leg up in terms of audience engagement, but let's not pretend like there wasn't already precedence for Jackson to fail in his adaptation attempts. After all, it was legendary animator Ralph Bakshi himself who once tried and failed to make an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings before Jackson did. His animated version from 1978 only manages to get about halfway through the story before the movie just stops somewhere near the end of The Two Towers. That film's failure as an adaptation does serve as a pretty good endorsement for Jackson's desire to see his version of The Lord of the Rings be made into three-hour-long movies comprised out of one giant, constantly running production. Because really, it was the only way to ensure that the movie could actually get made, and he wouldn't get screwed over halfway through like what happened with Bakshi. As a trilogy, there's just a lot that makes the Lord of the Rings films stand out. Pulling the Matrix series back into the mix, it is pretty clear to see the thick line of difference that separates the first Matrix film from the second and the third. The cast is different aside from the main three, the locations have changed, the lighting and cinematography all looks different. Even story-wise, it definitely feels like the arc of Neo has been concluded. All that he needed to accomplish on his hero's journey was accomplished in that first movie. It literally ends with him becoming Techno-Superman Jesus. There's not much we can go from there. So, Reloaded and Revolutions can't help but feel a little detached from what started off this whole journey in the first place. Whereas, on the other hand, there is so much synchronicity in The Lord of the Rings, so much that feels seamless, up to the point where all of its parts are kind of imperative to get the full experience of what Jackson was trying to accomplish with this story. Ask yourself this. How many times have you watched just one of the Lord of the Rings films, without also watching the other two? If you're like me, probably not a lot. Now, ask yourself the same question about the Matrix trilogy. How many times have you watched just one Matrix movie instead of watching all three? Probably a lot. And you probably weren't rewatching the last two. You were probably watching the first one.
Ergo, those that refuse the program, while a minority, if unchecked, would constitute an escalating problem.
Which is probably why, when film splitting continued into the 2000s, it was done in the Jackson mold and not in the Wachowski mold. The films that ended up getting split up in these years were almost always big-budget film adaptations of very popular novels, with the implied understanding that if given Jackson permission to make three-hour-long movies resulted in a notably persnickety fanbase completely eating it up, then surely letting every other director do the exact same thing will elicit the exact same results. That line of thinking coincided nicely with the growing trend of best-selling young adult fiction being adapted into big-budget movie franchises that started to crop up at around about the same time. The first of these films was the final installment of the Harry Potter series. As far as I can understand it, the initial idea to split their final movie was one that came about a bit more naturally and a little less cynically than you might expect from something with J.K. Rowling's name on it. When the Harry Potter film series started getting into the later books, it really became clear that they wouldn't be able to adapt the thicker material that Rowling started cranking out. Because of this, we got no Dobby cameos, and no subplot about why Dobby would have been better off had he remained a slave. Order of the Phoenix and the Half-Blood Prince were maligned for their omissions, and so the final film adaptation of the book entitled Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows was split in two, hopefully to alleviate this very concern. There was also a further underlying justification that this is the grand finale to the story after all, so why not go all out and leave no stone unturned? What we ended up getting was one movie that served as a fitting conclusion to the film series we'd been watching up to this point, and another movie that served as a very boring waiting room that you had to get through before you could watch the actual ending. The Deathly Hallows Part 1 sticks out in my memory as featuring only about 4 or 5 necessary scenes that are required to advance the plot forward, and most of them take place at the start or at the end of the movie. It's an odd patient zero for so many of the problems that befall films that are split up like this, but it also has so many flaws that are wholly unique to itself. Deathly Hallows Part 1 is an annoying film above all else. Annoying and mundane. There's this whole magical world out there, and we're 5 seconds away from the climax of this kid's whole life story, and we're spending our time going fucking camping. There isn't enough plot contained within the film to justify its own existence. You could edit it all into a 30-minute prologue and screen it before Part 2 like a short film with absolutely no loss. However, regardless of all that, it still made money. Because you had to watch The Deathly Hallows Part 1 if you wanted to watch The Deathly Hallows Part 2. And if you're a producer, the good news about that is if Part 2 ends up being satisfying, then nobody's going to give a shit that they had to suffer through some boring, overextended opening act. They won't care because ultimately they still got the ending that they wanted. You can get a lot by an audience if you finish strong, and it was this very method that went on to fuel the copycats of this era. Each subsequent young adult movie franchise attempted to ride the same high that Harry Potter had, but none of them really managed to get to that same level. Certainly not in the case of longevity, although you can see the Hunger Games franchises admirably trying. Most of these series just came and went, barely leaving any note behind aside from maybe Twilight, and also that porn adaptation of Twilight. But there's one would-be franchise that we shouldn't soon forget, because it has a very important lesson to teach us about the actual cost of film splitting. That would-be franchise is the Divergent series. The poor, poor Divergent series. Went ahead and flew too close to the sun, and did the thing that all of these films are most afraid of when they get split. They had a third movie, they had a third book. They decided to split the movie into 2 so they could cover more of the book's material, and then they only ever made 1 movie. Turns out the Divergent gang just didn't have the same staying power as Katniss Everdeen or whoever Robert Pattinson was playing, and so the third film, titled The Divergent Series: Allegiant, underperformed. The follow-up film was cancelled since it was no longer cost-effective to lose all that money again, and instead the story was planned to be continued with the TV series, but by that point basically the entire cast lost interest, and then so did the producers. The TV series was also cancelled, and that was it. The whole franchise fell apart because one movie underperformed, and then everyone just stopped caring. And yeah, you could say to yourself, this is just the Divergent series, who gives a fuck? And I'd counter that surely someone out there does. Someone has to have been a huge fan of that book series and ended up getting really excited for the films and then super disappointed with how it all turned out. I share that same pain. Everyone shares that pain. Everyone knows what it's like to see something they love remade into some shitty, disappointing movie. Ask me about the Percy Jackson film sometime.
What are you doing? Don't walk on my roof.
You might think that the quick rise and fall of the young adult book adaptation craze would have done enough to end film splitting for good, and for a while you'd be correct. But I'd argue as we got further into the 2010s, film splitting remained just as present as ever before. In fact, I might even say it evolved into something far more nefarious. To explain what I mean, we have to bring back Peter Jackson into the fold, as he was poised to effect another huge change on the industry, much like he did the last time he adapted a Tolkien novel. The long history and controversy of the live-action adaptation of The Hobbit has been thoroughly documented by this point. How it changed hands so many times until it fell back into Peter Jackson's lap, how horrible the shoot was, how awful everyone working on it felt, how it was overextended far beyond what should have been by Warner Brothers executives, and how it resulted in the biggest embarrassment for the Lord of the Rings franchise up until Bezos made Rings of Power. The live-action Hobbit trilogy has almost the exact opposite effect of the live-action Lord of the Rings trilogy. Unlike those films, The Hobbit slowly gets worse as it goes along, until the last in the series is a collection of deleted scenes hastily scrubbed together to form some semblance of a narrative. And what I think really makes these three films the exact karmic counterpoint to the original trilogy is that everything that makes those original films great simultaneously makes The Hobbit suck. The extended time does not make the film a more accurate adaptation. In fact, it just means there's a bunch of extra bullshit thrown in to justify its length. Which might make you a little peeved if you bought a ticket for a live-action version of The Hobbit, starring a bunch of dwarves and their hobbit friends going on an adventure, but instead you got a bunch of Silmarillion cliff notes. Or how about this thrown-in romance with Evangeline Lilly that goes absolutely nowhere? Or why not have Legolas show up for some reason? Nothing about the Hobbit film series is motivated by attempting to accurately adapt the original work of J.R.R. Tolkien, especially the choice to make this short children's book into another collection of three-hour-long fantasy epics. Every decision made for how that book's story would be depicted on screen was informed by greed and nothing else. Which I will admit is a little bit funny given what the story of The Hobbit is so obviously about.
Dragon sickness.
The Hobbit marked a turning point in the film-splitting trend. Yeah, it was still technically a book adaptation, but only under the most superficial of examinations. The Hobbit trilogy was created only to make money. There were 3 of them because if there was only 1 or 2 of them, you'd only have to buy 1 or 2 tickets, and 3 is a bigger number than 1 or 2. I promise you, this is all the thought that went into making the decision to split up these films. And unfortunately, it did work. The Hobbit made a shit ton of money. Which is probably why film splitting continued to be copied by so many other shameless franchisers going for big bucks. However, there was a slight shift this time around. Even though The Hobbit made a lot of money, it was hard to deny that it had an abysmal critical reception, especially Battle of the Five Armies. Audiences, too, had grown a little weary from years of dealing with the young adult adaptation practice of splitting the last movie into 2, and so at this time, any film that greeted you at the box office with a Part 1 or a Part 2 at the end of it was often met with suspicion. This is probably why both Marvel and DC decided to shift gears and rename their Avengers and Justice League movies as actual titles instead of just Avengers Something Part 1 or Something versus the Justice League Part 2. And honestly, this might be all it takes for a sizable number of complaints from this practice to disappear, because not having that Part 1 or Part 2 at the end does actually do a lot of uplifting. It frees these films from so many expectations that they might otherwise have to deal with. Losing the whole Part 2, Chapter 3 bullcrap gives enough leeway so if something bad happens, you always have the option of just pretending that your 2-parter movie isn't actually a 2-parter and you can just follow it up with whatever you want. And not much will be lost and no one will really care because it's not like you explicitly promised them something. There's just a lot more freedom that the removal of a Part 1 can do for your movie series. Freedom that certain production companies are all too happy to take advantage of. Since now this isn't really film splitting in the classical sense, it doesn't have the same connotations as it did before, and you can start to get a lot more past an audience than you used to. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is probably the ones who take advantage of this obfuscation more than anybody else. At a point, what you're doing can't really be called splitting films if every single film is a continuation of the last one, if every single TV show is a continuation of the last one. As these superhero productions get layered over top of each other, they start to blend together more and more, and it is certainly not helped by Disney shooting everything on that stagecraft set they built. In retrospect, it was only a matter of time before the usual strengths of film splitting would turn and become weaknesses for Marvel. Like, it's fun when you watch The Lord of the Rings and you get to see everything is filmed the same way and has the same visual and audio style throughout the story, but going through 20-something superhero movies that all have the same flat color scheme as each other and are all probably filmed on the exact same soundstage with the exact same crew, it gets stale and boring. The fact that it all takes place in the same universe and has this overarching story is great and all, but with a storyline that's built out across so many years with so many different creatives at the helm, it was always doomed to implode at some point. Really, Marvel and its pretenders are just doing the same endless sequelizing I talked about in the beginning of the video that Lucas and Spielberg were up to with Star Wars and Indiana Jones. It's just with the added caveat that Kevin Feige's plan is designed to be never-ending. And that might sound like a very clever solution, except it's absolutely impossible. The plan is eventually going to end. At some point, the Marvel Cinematic Universe will stop, if only because you can't keep splitting one movie forever. Like it or not, people want conclusions to their stories. They want to feel satisfied by the end of a movie. And endless cinematic universes don't provide that. They aren't designed to. Marvel was wise to bite the bullet and take advantage of every payoff they could when they made Infinity War and Endgame, but once you do that, you basically can't ever do it again. You got all the famous people together to fight the big bad guy, and that's really the only benefit you get out of cinematic universe that's this long running. After a while, the story is undone by the very thing that made it interesting in the first place.
Must really eat you up that you're not the one who killed him.
Which is probably why now in the 2020s, film splitting has reached its most prevalent and probably most dangerous form yet. All the mutations that have been inherited from years under Marvel and a million shitty justifications from streaming services have allowed Hollywood to give themselves permission to split up just about any movie they want now. Mostly, we're getting an extension of the old YA formula of having the last part of the story split into two pieces, only this time around it's not so much happening to the conclusion of book adaptations so much as it's happening to the conclusion of huge franchises in a similar vein to Infinity War and Endgame. That's probably why we're getting stuff like a Fast and Furious movie being left on a cliffhanger, or Tom Cruise's latest Mission Impossible film being cut in half. And as much as I've argued against this sort of thing, especially in how it affects films story-wise, it is difficult to really get into a heated debate when it comes to movies like this. Critiquing the story and plotting of a Fast and Furious film, or a Mission Impossible movie, feels like complaining about something that the filmmakers themselves don't even care about. I don't feel as bad saying who cares what happens to Ethan Hunt or Dominic Toretto as saying the same thing about the Divergent characters, because just about nobody is watching these films because of some close, important connections to the characters and their respective emotional journeys. These are action figure men doing action men stunts, and everything that surrounds the movie is a justification to facilitate more of these high-octane sequences. Even having the pretense of a narrative surrounding these huge set pieces feels lazier to me than just making a full-on, straightforward, balls-to-the-wall action movie like Hardcore Henry or Crank. If you want to talk about the merits of those movies as entertainment and art, you have to accept that film splitting really does nothing to change how people view these inherently disposable films. But, for the record, I will say that Tom Cruise did a much better job at crafting a first act for an action film than Vin Diesel did. I think if you're going to make an epic stunt movie like this and cut it in half, you have to escalate the stakes of the situation in a way that feels in line with all that came before it, as is the case for the ending of Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Fast X fails because it doesn't do this, and instead tries to make you fret over the mortality of a bunch of characters who have already proven over 10 other films that they are functionally immortal. Jason Momoa was pretty good though, I liked him.
Here we go!
When there is a possibility that film splitting can actually fuck up a good story is when we should start to be concerned. Which brings us finally to the twin dilemmas currently being brought to the world's attention, courtesy of Warner Brothers and Sony. On the one hand, you have Denis Villeneuve and his Dune movies, and on the other, you have Phil Lord and his Spider-Verse sequels. Like Jackson and the Wachowskis before, we have the case where a monumentally popular live-action adaptation of a novel is set up right next to the back-to-back sequels/trilogy conclusion of an already hugely popular film series. As of the recording of this video, only one Dune movie has come out, and only one Spider-Verse sequel has been released. So, that's what I got to work with in this comparison. But so far, both of these films, and far more importantly, their prospective futures, tell us a lot about how film splitting may be used in the coming years. 2021's Dune has quite a lot in common with the live-action Lord of the Rings films, in that it is also an adaptation of a foundational series of novels that has had numerous failed adaptations prior, and is now finally being granted the time and resources to do it justice. Wouldn't Bondarchuk be proud? But Denny has not been given nearly as easy a time making his trilogy as Peter Jackson did back in 2000. Like Ralph Bakshi's 1978 Lord of the Rings, 2021's Dune only covers about half of the story. Things just stop after 2.5 hours. This was Denis Villeneuve's choice. He stuck to the old reasons provided to him by Jackson and ended his movie with the story half told and the promise that it would be fully told in a sequel. However, unlike Jackson, Denny was not given the same assurance that the continuation to his film would actually definitively end up getting made. Good old Warner Brothers was skeptical about the adaptation of one of the most seminal sci-fi novels ever by a wildly popular sci-fi director being a hit, and so they hadn't greenlit a Dune Part 2, even while Dune Part 1 was being made. When production on Part 1 wrapped, Denny did his best to keep the ball rolling for a quick turnaround if the movie became successful, since that's all he had to ride on. If it didn't, then that would have been a wrap on his version of Dune. We never would have gotten to see a good adaptation of Frank Herbert's classic novel, and after what happened with Blade Runner 2049, Denny probably wouldn't get the chance to touch the sci-fi genre ever again. Thankfully, and mainly due to word of mouth that Part 2 hadn't been greenlit yet, Dune Part 1 was a success, and we are well on our way to getting to watch a full and complete adaptation of Paul Atreides' story at long last. Of course, it is always possible that we may not end up getting an actual good adaptation of Dune in the end. I mean, I don't doubt that the guy who is yet to make a bad movie is going to start now, but hey, nobody knows the future. Case in point, the film was scheduled to come out in late fall 2023, but that's been wavering ever since the actor and writer strikes began. And even if it still comes out as scheduled, the strikes are still ongoing, and more time between production is only going to hurt the Dune franchise worse, especially if Denny really wants to follow it up with a Dune Messiah adaptation like he's been not so subtly planning. And this is where we really get into the big flaws with movie splitting as it affects this particular film. Denny might not have had a choice given his situation, but it's hard to discount how many issues have emerged from this decision. The first part of his Dune feels woefully unfinished, and personally I feel like I can't even judge his adaptation yet because of this fact. There is so much that's set up in Dune Part 1, and not getting to really experience any of the payoff for it leaves the film incomplete, and it makes its ending feel so disjointed with what came before and likely what'll come after, even if admittedly there's really no other place in the novel's story where he could have put the split. If you were to ask me right now, what do I think of Denis Villeneuve's version of Dune, I would tell you to ask me again when I finally managed to finish watching it. Because I didn't watch a movie. I watched half a movie, and then someone pressed pause. I'm still patiently waiting for them to hit unpause so I can watch the other half and figure out if the first half was actually good. The time that it's taken to get to that point has been admittedly annoying. But it's hard to care about that when you know at some point the movie is going to come out and none of this is going to be an issue for anyone anymore. Once Dune Part 2 arrives this November, for the rest of history, everyone can just watch Part 2 right after they finish Part 1, like they do with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's a problem, but only for a little while. As long as the movie still ends up coming out, everything will be fine. And since we know that Denny has actually already made the film, there's no worry that things could end up going the same way as the Divergent series. Yet. The same, however, cannot be said for the animated Spider-Verse series, which is in a pretty precarious position as of late. Oh sure, the latest sequel, Across the Spider-Verse, was a huge hit critically and commercially, just like the previous film had been. If you weren't paying attention, you'd call the whole endeavor a resounding successful implementation of movie splitting. Everybody loved it, and everybody can't wait to see the conclusion of Miles Morales' story in Beyond the Spider-Verse coming March 29th, 2024, a date that I'm sure won't ever be changed. Really, it gives me no pleasure here to be the stick in the mud, pointing out the issues in something everybody likes, but Across the Spider-Verse is not without its faults, and almost all of these flaws come from its decision to be a two-parter instead of just a complete story told in one movie. Across the Spider-Verse features some of the strangest and most ass-backwards pacing and structure that I have ever seen in a script that is otherwise so well made. Like, the big sticking point for many is the climax of the film, and how things play out after the big Spider-Man chase in Miguel's dimension. And that is admittedly pretty sloppy, but I think the issue actually starts right from the very beginning. The movie opens with Gwen Stacy, and we get a sort of prologue sequence with her in her dimension. But then, once it's over, we're pulled back into Miles' universe, and the movie kind of restarts again. The perspective seems so clearly to be Gwen's when the film began, but for the rest of it, until basically the last scene, we are entirely following Miles and Miles alone. The movie is about him, and it's told from his POV. So Gwen has this one pivotal scene, but for some reason half of it is played at the start of the movie, and the other half is played 2 hours later right before the movie ends. It's not even like it's a bad scene, in fact it's a great scene. But its positioning makes the whole movie so uneven. When we're placed back in Miles' shoes, we're like 3 steps ahead of him because the audience just saw what happened with Gwen and her interactions with the other spider people. But that doesn't even get us all caught up with Gwen when she comes back because she learned and did a lot more stuff in the background that we never got to see. But we don't even know that Gwen knows all this other stuff and had all these other adventures until way later in the film. This makes the audience out of step with all of the main characters until we reach the big reveal where all the spider people finally confront Miles about what will happen to his father. That's the real, practical reason for Gwen's bisected scene with her father, to mirror what will happen to Miles and also reveal an alternative solution at the end of the movie, which in retrospect was pretty obvious. Spider-Man doesn't have to have a cop friend killed if his cop friend just gets another job. Gwen's final talk with her father right before the end of the film and the unveiling of canon events are what finally clicks everything into place narratively and thematically for Across the Spider-Verse, even if it is at the cost of some of its own emotional weight. Which is why when things came to a close not too long following these revelations, I was disappointed, because I just got my midpoint story reveal and I was excited to see it follow through into the Act 3 climax, but I never got that. We'd already spent so much of the movie behind on what the main conflict was supposed to be that now that we've gotten to its emotional peak, there's no fucking time left. You and I didn't get to see that transition into the Act 3 climax because the movie got split into 2, and now we're stuck waiting until they finally make Beyond the Spider-Verse. And that is, if they even actually do make Beyond the Spider-Verse, since unlike Dune Part 2, this follow-up getting released isn't exactly a certainty right now. Sorry to be the spoil sport again, but given all that's happened recently and all that is now known about the production of Across the Spider-Verse, I would feel very nervous about the future of this franchise. When I first had the idea to make this video, most of what I wanted to talk about in the Spider-Verse section was my worry that something bad could happen that might fuck up the possibility of Beyond the Spider-Verse being released promptly. The film ends on such a dangling, unresolved cliffhanger that a lot of the narrative momentum is going to lie on when and how we get to the next part of this story. And there's a part of me that thinks we're on the cusp of another Half-Life 3 situation. And now, after the writer's strike, the actor's strike, and another expose of animators being horribly mistreated, it's hard to feel like I was wrong to be worried. Vulture recently released an article showcasing all the numerous ways the animation team who created this bold new style of movement was absolutely fucked over by Sony and producer Phil Lord. Even noted Obama supporter Amy Pascal chimed in with some thoughtful comments to add to the article. What a good person. If you're a fan of the Spider-Verse series or just a fan of animation in general, then I would highly recommend giving it a read, if only to understand just how awful it is for so many animators out there right now. This is hardly the only story like it, and it's getting to the point where the field of animation feels like it's not so much composed of artists who want to use their talents to expand the craft that they have devoted their life to, but more like a bunch of emaciated masochists who joined the least fun death cult ever. Things cannot keep going like this. This cannot last if the field of animation is going to last. So for all the animators out there, I wish you good luck and the strength, or at least financial stability, to avoid sacrificing yourselves on the blood altar that is sure to be Beyond the Spider-Verse's production, or frankly, any other production like it.
You made a mistake.
Hollywood and the studio system at large is in a bad and entirely deserved spot right now. Everything is at a standstill and nothing is getting made, so as it stands, who knows what will happen to film splitting in the coming years. Fuck, who even knows what the future of the film industry will be after this summer? Unlike my other videos, I don't really have a final point to land on here. Going through all these split movies, you start to see this pattern of things balancing themselves out a little bit. For every It Chapter 2, there's a Kill Bill Volume 2. For every cynical, over-elongated film franchise, you have something totally fucking sweet like the John Wick film franchise. There is no one end-all, be-all correct way to produce a film for maximum effectiveness. Each movie is unique, and each individual artist brings something unique to the project. There will be times where a film's story will be split into 2 separate pieces, and it will be entirely justified, and there will be probably many, many more times where a film is split into 2 pieces where it isn't justified whatsoever. Audiences will just have to take things on a case-by-case basis and use their own intuition to determine whether a split film is worth watching. It is no secret that producers will continue to do everything they can to squeeze out every drop of monetary value from any lucrative intellectual property that they might happen to currently own, and with this tactic, they'll manage to come up right about 50% of the time, more or less. Ultimately, it is up to us as consumers to decide what filmmaking practice we deem permissible with our wallets. If you want, we could all just wait until the second part comes out before we give away our money for the first part. And in doing so, we'll probably lose out on movies like Dune or The Lord of the Rings. Alternatively, we can just accept that film splitting is here to stay and will probably be abused to its fullest extent by Hollywood. This is kind of an all-or-nothing deal. The film industry doesn't work in a sensical way. Producers don't see the forest for the trees. They don't see how these decisions won't work in a vacuum. They just see the box office returns and copy it. As the timeline of events in this video has shown, film splitting has been used in a number of different decades for a number of different reasons and will probably be used in a new way sometime soon. But whatever it will mutate into next, it is going to be determined by what does well now. So each of us is going to have to make the choice ourselves when we go to the theaters. Do we want more adaptations of Frank Herbert's Dune or more sequels to The Fast and the Furious? I know where I'm leaning. Thanks for watching this part of the video. I hope you watch the next part too. Goodbye.